Hello, future PTAs. So we already had one lecture on normal gait, actually one in Rehab 2 or in Kinese 2, Rehab 1, Kinese 2, where we just mentioned the phases, but we're going to go in a little bit more depth, cover them more deeply. So we'll start out with some definitions. So gait in itself refers to the breakdown of walking into phases. When we use gait analysis, it is used to determine why one person's walk appears differently from another in order to pinpoint an underlying cause. So some of those underlying causes would be muscle weakness, muscle tone or spasticity, pain, nerve damage, deformity, range of motion limitations. There's countless more, but those are just some of the basic causes that could cause a gait abnormality. Gait cycle, stride length, step length, we've covered already, but I'll just give you a quick reminder of what each of those are, and you have the definitions on here as well as the former PowerPoint lecture. So your stride is the time between one foot touching the ground or from any point of the gait cycle, and then that same foot reaching that same point of the gait cycle. So if you're doing heel strike, it would be from the moment the right foot reaches heel strike until the moment the right foot reaches heel strike again. So one stride completes one full gait cycle. And so the measurement of a stride length would be also the measurement of one full gait cycle. Versus step length, it should really be about half of the gait cycle because it's the distance from one foot hitting the ground into the opposite foot either hitting the ground, or if you choose another portion of the gait cycle like push off, then it would be from one push off to the opposite foot pushing off. If you increase your walking speed, typically the step length will increase. You'll widen your step. Slower walking, you typically decrease your step length and take smaller steps, but the step length from the right side to the left should be equal with normal gait. Typically, if one step is smaller or shorter than the other, then it is an abnormal gait. Cadence is something we haven't spoken a lot about. That's just your walking speed or the number of steps you can take per minute. That is your cadence. And then the two encompassing phases of gait are stance phase and swing phase. Stance phase is when your foot is in contact with the ground and is about 60% of the gait cycle. And swing phase is when your foot is off the ground and is about 40% of the gait cycle. All right, we have not really covered single limb support, double limb support, and non-support. So we will cover those now. Now it's mentioned down here in the picture at the bottom of the picture. Non-support's not in this picture because non-support only occurs during running. So single limb support occurs when one foot is in contact with the ground. It occurs at the first time during stance phase of one leg, we'll say the right, and again during stance phase of the other leg, we'll say the left. Each time it occurs about 40% of the gait cycle, so really about 80% of the total gait cycle you're in single limb support. Double limb support is the period where both legs are in contact with the ground. So it happens the moment one heel strikes the ground until the moment the other foot is off the ground, until toe off. So once your foot is in contact with the ground until the other foot leaves the ground, that is double limb support. It's only about 10% of the gait cycle on each step. So you add those together and that's about 20% of your total gait cycle. Non-support is when neither leg is in contact with the ground. It only occurs during walking or running, not walking, only occurs during running, and is really the primary difference between an analysis of someone's walking gait versus someone's run. Non-support is the only additional phase that does not occur during walking. I'm going to make that a little bit larger. Okay, so our three tasks of the gait cycle are weight acceptance, single limb support, and leg advancement. During weight acceptance, it's the beginning of the stance phase, and it is when your body weight begins to shift onto that leg. So you've hit the ground with that leg, and now you are shifting your body weight over top of that leg in order to free the other leg to leave the ground. That's called weight acceptance. Single limb support we've already covered. It's when one foot is on the ground, and of course the other limb is then able to swing forward. And leg advancement is when the limb is swinging forward. So first you hit the ground, you put your weight on that leg, then you are standing only on that leg while the other leg is free. And once the other leg hits the ground and accepts the weight, you free that leg up in order to advance it and move it forward, which would be swing phase. Analysis of stance phase. We've already talked about all of these in depth. Of course, initial contact is when the heel strikes the floor. Loading response is when weight begins to shift onto that leg until the foot is flat on the ground. Mid stance is when basically everything is in a line over top of the leg. Terminal stance is the very end of weight on that. So we're in double limb support at this point, and the heel is beginning to lift off the ground. So heel off is what I typically call that one, but it's also terminal stance. When the heel begins to lift off the ground, and then toe off, which is also pre-swing. It starts once the other foot touches the ground, ends once the toe is completely off the ground. So that is double limb support. All right, so terminal stance. Let me go back over when it starts and ends. Begins when the heel begins to lift off the ground, ends when the other leg comes in contact with the ground. Okay, so you're not in double limb support until pre-swing. Okay, so with heel strike, you're in double limb support. With foot flat, let me go to that that picture actually. Okay, so with heel strike, you're in double limb support. Once foot flat occurs, the other limb is up off the ground. That's once toe off happens. So you're in single limb support, and then you get back into double limb support at toe off. Okay. So in the terms I was just calling them, you would be in single limb support at heel strike, leave it at foot, or in initial contact, leave it at loading response, and then not enter it again until toe off, pre-swing. Okay. Then with the swing phase, of course, your initial swing or acceleration is when the reference limb begins to move forward, and it ends when it's positioned directly under the body. Then mid-swing is once it reaches directly under the body, or maximal knee flexion, and then ends once it's perpendicular to the floor. Terminal swing is the point when it begins to extend. So rather than knee flexion, you're starting to go towards knee extension, and as soon as the foot contacts the ground, swing phase is over. So of course, terminal swing would also be over. All right, additional determinants of gait. This is just a list that we're about to go through: vertical displacement, horizontal displacement, width of walking base, lateral pelvic tilt, and reciprocal arm swing. So our vertical displacement is an up and down movement that occurs during normal gait. The highest point in the gait cycle would be during mid stance. The lowest point would be during heel strike. And the amount of vertical displacement is typically only about 2 inches. Horizontal displacement is a little bit of a side-to-side shift as we shift our center of gravity over the stance limb. So it occurs mostly during single limb support. So if you're standing on the right, you shift your weight over the right leg. Once you're standing on the left, you're shifting your weight over the left leg. And it is also about 2 inches in a normal average gait cycle. The width of the walking base is if you take a measurement between the 2 feet. So if you made a line directly down the middle of your right foot, all the steps on your right foot and a line on the left, and then measure the distance between that line. It's typically about 2 to 4 inches apart, but it's going to vary depending on the individual. If they have wider hips, if they have genu varus versus genu valgus, and it may also vary different stages of life. So at infancy, it's going to be a wider base of support. In late adulthood, like if they have balance issues, they're going to have a wider stage of support. During pregnancy, you typically have a wider base of support. So this could vary from one season of life to another in the same individual as well. Lateral pelvic tilt, up until now, we've always looked at it as a negative thing, as far as any lateral pelvic tilt would indicate weakness in the gluteus medius. However, there is a certain degree of a lateral pelvic tilt that is normal. Hold on. Excuse me. So the lateral pelvic tilt is just a slight downward motion that actually happens in normal gait whenever you begin to accept weight off of one leg. Okay, when you're beginning to shift the weight off of one leg and enter the swing phase. So in this picture, they are shifting the weight onto the left leg and entering swing phase with the right, and so the right side would drop. Now, the muscles that counteract that drop are the abductors on the left, or on the stance limb. Of course, the gluteus medius on the stance limb, and then the erector spinae and the quadratus lumborum on the opposite limb. And if you remember, we went over that during the hip lecture earlier this semester, as well as that force couple, where the gluteus medius, I say abductors and gluteus medius, however, the gluteus medius is the primary abductor, but I just wanted to kind of shout out the gluteus medius. You know, it's kind of my favorite. But they are activating on the stance leg, and then the force couple, the opposite muscle that has the same activation is the quadratus lumborum, and of course the erector spinae. So with Trendelenburg gait, that is basically where they have excessive lateral pelvic tilt. We know that's related to gluteus medius weakness, and it is when they excessively tilt the pelvis, which would be in a downward motion towards the swinging limb. But the weakness would be indicated on the stance limb, because that's the gluteus medius that should be activating. Reciprocal arm swing. Whenever you're swinging one leg forward, the opposite arm is actually swinging at the same time. The trunk on the side of the limb progressing forward actually rotates forward slightly, and the arm swinging on the opposite side helps to counteract that trunk rotation. So far we've basically talked all about legs from the hips below, and we haven't talked about the head, arms, and trunk. So we call that the hat, whether we're talking about balance or gait. The head, arms, and trunk are referred to as the hat, and typically the hat is just along for the ride throughout the gait cycle. It's not doing very much. Other than this reciprocal arm swing and slight trunk rotation, the only thing the head, arms, and trunk do, the head stays erect, the shoulders stay level, and the trunk stays extended. So they just maintain a good alignment in an ideal gait pattern. Now we'll talk about rockers. There are 3 rockers in your gait: heel rocker, ankle rocker, and forefoot rocker. The rockers occur with momentum of the leg in contact with the ground in order to redistribute your weight across the foot that is as the limb is progressing forward. So the foot that's in contact with the ground, as you're rocking forward on that foot, that limb is accepting weight and it's being redistributed by these rockers. Some gait analysis books refer to rockers, but when we use them really the most in PT practice is when we're talking to an orthotist. If we have orthotist coming in to develop some orthotic brace or something for one of our patients, they typically talk about rockers because some of the orthotic devices will limit your ability to perform certain rockers. They'll block the movement or alter the gait pattern based on the rockers. So the heel rocker, that occurs during heel strike and during loading response. So once the foot hits the ground and as you're starting to progress the weight forward. Ankle rocker is during mid stance, so the foot's already on the ground and the rocking motion is just happening over the ankle. And then in the forefoot rocker is in terminal stance. So as the heel lifts off from the ground, then you're rocking forward on the forefoot. So heel rocker, you're rocking forward on the heel. Sorry. Ankle rocker, you are moving forward at the ankle, and toe rocker, you're rocking forward onto the toe. Forefoot rocker, you're rocking forward onto the forefoot. The toe rocker is what I was reading as I was talking. Can happen during pre-swing. I'm so sorry, it's late. The toe rocker can happen during pre-swing or during toe off. Some texts include it and some do not. So we'll just focus on the other three rockers: heel rocker, ankle, and forefoot rocker. There are some differences in different phases of life. So in a young child that's just learning to walk, they have a wider base of support. This is still considered normal gait for them. A wider base of support, faster cadence, so they're taking quick steps, decreased stride length, which basically allows them to have less time in swing phase and more time in double limb support. Foot flat at heel strike, so they just land with foot flat the whole time. The knees stay extended during stance phase, and a lot of their movement comes actually from trunk rotation. And then minimum arm swing. Typically, they're going to hold their arms out like this in order to balance themselves. So they're really not doing a reciprocal arm swing. They're just holding them out to steady themselves. And in older adults, there's also very common gait changes. Now, this I wouldn't consider quite as normal. Typically, what will happen is that they'll start to develop a fear of falling. Falling, as we've talked about so many times, leads to a decline in overall health and there's a lot of correlation with falls and decreased life expectancy. And so as they see a neighbor fall or a friend fall and get hospitalized and never return home, they get scared of falling. They know that that is typically the beginning of a bad turn of events and often change their gait pattern in order to try to avoid falls. The unfortunate part is the way they change their gait pattern makes them more likely to fall because they have they don't clear the ground as well, and so then they end up shuffling and shuffling their foot over something or getting their foot stubbed on something in the pathway, which causes the fall. But some of these changes are typically they slow down, decrease the gait speed, increase the time in stance phase, so they're keeping the foot on the ground as long as possible, trying to avoid taking the foot off the ground, which some people even begin to shuffle for that reason and not have the foot leave the ground at all. Increase time in double limb support, decrease step length. Oftentimes they'll take a little tiny step, mainly because they're trying to rush the other foot to the ground. Decrease in vertical displacement, so they typically have kind of a wide base of support, but they don't really shift their weight over each leg to free up the leg. They just hold their weight in the middle and shuffle their feet. Decrease foot clearance and an increase in the horizontal displacement. Vertical displacement, that's the up and down. Increase in horizontal displacement of movement side to side. So again, this is typically related to a fear of falling, but does not help them avoid falling. It actually makes them more likely to fall. I do want you to take a look at the videos. The one with the child is a little bit long. You don't have to watch it all, but just to notice these changes in the gait pattern with children who are learning to walk. And then with the elderly as well, just to notice some of the common gait changes. Okay, and our last slide, quick little play closet today, is some tips for gait analysis. So definitely analyze with the shoes on as well as without the shoes. Oftentimes the shoes will be built up in a certain pattern based on the way they've been wearing them, or if they have special orthotic inserts that will help normalize their gait pattern. So you want to watch how they're walking with the shoes on and with them off. You want to look at it from various angles if you can. So in the picture, someone's behind, but if you can also get to the side where the camera person's standing or to the front, it would assist you in looking from multiple angles. Ideally, you would record the gait and then rewatch it, replay it, slow it down if you have that capability, because sometimes it's really hard to get everything you need from just watching them walk once or twice, and they may get fatigued really easily and not be able to walk more than that. And then try to analyze them at the beginning of the session when they really don't know that you're watching them walk, because just like with taking somebody's respiratory rate, as soon as you tell them that you're taking their respiratory rate, they start controlling their breathing and being more intentional. And even if they're trying to tell themselves, don't, just breathe normally, they're so aware of their breathing, it changes the respiratory rate. Same with walking. If you say, okay, now I'm going to watch you walk, all of a sudden they straighten up and they're real careful about the way they're stepping and trying to, walk with good form, versus if you just walk them or watch them on the way in, it might be an entirely different walk. The other thing I have seen as well is someone, that kind of puts on a little show, especially if maybe there's a lawsuit or something. They're trying to, make sure that their condition is obvious while they're at the clinic so that your paperwork supports them getting a little more money. So just be careful about that. You may want to watch while they're getting out of their car and walking in from the parking lot and see if that gait pattern matches what they're doing in the clinic. I have seen people get out of their car and move just, as good as normal. And as soon as they open the door, they hunch their back over and they start completely changing their gait pattern, slowing it down and widen their base of support. And so just be a little cautious about that. If you do have a way of watching them when they don't know, it would be better, not to try and trick them into anything, but just because then that's their actual gait pattern. That's not the one they're putting on. Based on either what they think that you want to see or what they think they should show in order to prove that they're in pain. So this is our normal gait. So we talked about the phases. We talked about double limb support, single limb support. We mentioned the 3 task of gait: weight acceptance, single limb support, and leg advancement. And then we also went into the various determinants of gait and the rockers of gait. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I will see you guys in lab soon.